In 1981, a single night shift at an exclusive Beverly Hills restaurant changed everything. A valet driver named Chris Smith clocked in for what should have been routine work parking luxury cars for wealthy patrons. By morning, he had vanished along with $5.6 million in cash and bearer bonds that had been stored in a private vault beneath the establishment. No witnesses saw him leave, no security cameras captured his exit. No fingerprints were found on the emptied safe. For over 2 decades, the case remained one of California's most baffling unsolved thefts, filed away in dusty archives and forgotten by all but a few determined investigators. Then, in 2007, a parking ticket issued on a quiet residential street in Phoenix, Arizona, would crack open a mystery that had stayed buried for 26 years. What started as a routine traffic violation would unravel a carefully constructed new identity and expose a trail of deception that stretched across state lines and decades of silence. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The restaurant where it all began was called the Golden Palm, a high-end establishment tucked into the hills above Sunset Boulevard. It catered to entertainment industry executives, real estate moguls, and old-money families who valued discretion above all else. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside. A converted Spanish colonial mansion with ivy-covered walls and understated signage. But beneath its ground-floor dining room lay something far more valuable than the finest wines in its cellar. The basement vault had been installed in the late 1970s as a private service for select clientele. Wealthy patrons could store valuable items, important documents, and substantial amounts of cash in individual safety deposit compartments. The service operated on complete anonymity. No names were recorded, only numerical codes known exclusively to the box holders. Access required 2 keys, one held by the client and another by the restaurant's management. The system had functioned flawlessly for 3 years without a single incident. Chris Smith had been working as a valet at the Golden Palm for 8 months when the theft occurred. At 28 years old, he was older than most valets and carried himself with a quiet professionalism that both guests and management appreciated. He arrived on time, worked efficiently, and rarely engaged in casual conversation with other staff members. His background check had been clean, showing steady employment at various service jobs throughout Los Angeles with no criminal record or financial troubles. What made Smith different from other employees was his keen observation skills. During his months at the restaurant, he had noticed patterns in the clientele, the timing of vault visits, and the security protocols that governed access to the basement. He observed which patrons carried themselves with the confidence that comes from substantial wealth, which ones arrived at specific times on predictable schedules, and which ones seemed nervous when entering or leaving the vault area. The night of March 15, 1981, began like any other Saturday evening shift. Smith arrived at 6 p.m. wearing his standard uniform, a crisp white shirt, black slacks, and the burgundy vest that identified Golden Palm staff. The parking area was already busy with luxury vehicles, Rolls-Royces, Mercedes sedans, and Cadillacs lined up in neat rows under the soft glow of ornate street lamps. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from the restaurant's carefully maintained gardens. By 8 p.m., the dinner rush was in full swing. Smith moved between vehicles with practiced efficiency, retrieving keys when guests departed, and ensuring that every car was positioned for quick access. The restaurant's maitre d' had complimented him earlier on his ability to remember exactly where each vehicle was parked, a skill that impressed even the most demanding clientele. What no one realized was that Smith had been studying more than just parking arrangements. Over the previous months, he had carefully observed the vault access routine. He knew that Saturday evenings typically saw the heaviest vault activity, as wealthy patrons often retrieved cash for weekend expenses or stored valuable items acquired during the week. He had noticed that the restaurant manager, Vincent Moreau, made his final vault security check around 11 p.m. before retiring to his upstairs office to handle administrative tasks. Smith had also discovered something crucial about the vault's dual key system. While each safety deposit box required 2 keys for access, the master vault door itself could be opened with a single key held by management. This key was kept in Moreau's office safe, but Smith had observed the combination being entered during a late-night cleaning shift when he had volunteered to help with extra duties. The manager had been grateful for the assistance and hadn't noticed Smith's careful attention to the safe's operation. The breakthrough in Smith's plan came through a stroke of calculated patience. 3 weeks before the theft, he had discovered that one of the vault's regular clients, an elderly real estate investor named Harold Weinstein, had been hospitalized following a minor heart attack. Weinstein's safety deposit box contained a substantial amount of cash and bearer bonds, but his hospitalization meant the box would remain untouched for an extended period. More importantly, Smith had overheard a conversation between Weinstein's adult son and Vincent Moreau, confirming that the family would not be accessing the box for several weeks while the patriarch recovered. This information provided Smith with the perfect target. Box 247 contained approximately $5.6 million in various forms, including $3.2 million in cash, $1.8 million in bearer bonds, and nearly $600,000 in rare coins and jewelry. The bearer bonds were particularly valuable because they functioned like cash, requiring no registration or identification for redemption. Smith knew that if he could access this specific box, he would have weeks or potentially months before the theft was discovered. As the evening progressed toward midnight, Smith began implementing his plan. He had volunteered to work a double shift, covering for another valet who had called in sick. This gave him legitimate reason to be on the premises well into the early morning hours when the restaurant would be nearly empty. The last dinner guest typically departed by 1 a.m., leaving only a skeleton crew of cleaning staff and security. At 12:30 a.m., Smith made his move. He entered the restaurant through the staff entrance, using his employee keycard to bypass the main security system. The building was quiet except for the distant sounds of dishes being washed in the kitchen and the low hum of cleaning equipment. He moved through the familiar corridors with confidence, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floors. Vincent Moreau's office was located on the second floor, accessible by a narrow staircase originally built for servants when the building had been a private residence. Smith climbed the stairs slowly, listening for any indication that someone else might be nearby. The office door was unlocked, as was typical during evening operations when Moreau frequently moved between the dining room and his administrative duties. The safe stood in the corner behind Moreau's desk, a heavy steel unit that had been installed when the vault service began. Smith approached it with steady hands, his months of observation about to pay off. He entered the combination he had memorized weeks earlier, turning the dial with precise movements. The mechanism clicked softly, and the door swung open to reveal various documents, cash reserves for daily operations, and most importantly, the master vault key. Smith pocketed the key and closed the safe, ensuring that everything appeared undisturbed. He then made his way back downstairs toward the basement vault, moving through the restaurant's main dining room, where empty tables sat beneath dim lighting, their white linens ghostly in the shadows. The vault entrance was concealed behind a bookshelf in what appeared to be a private dining alcove. Smith activated the hidden mechanism and watched as the bookshelf slid aside, revealing a steel door marked only with a small brass plaque bearing the restaurant's logo. He inserted the master key and felt the heavy door unlock with a solid click that echoed in the narrow stairwell leading down to the vault chamber. The basement vault stretched before Smith like a bank's safety deposit room, with numbered compartments lining both walls from floor to ceiling. Each box was secured with dual locks, but Smith had prepared for this obstacle months in advance. During his careful observations, he had noticed that several clients carried spare keys on elaborate keychains, often leaving them momentarily unattended while dining or using the restroom. Through a combination of quick impressions in soft clay and patient waiting, he had managed to create duplicates of 3 separate client keys, including the one belonging to Harold Weinstein. Box 247 sat at eye level on the left wall, its brass nameplate gleaming under the vault's fluorescent lighting. Smith retrieved Weinstein's duplicate key from his pocket and inserted it alongside the master key he had taken from Moreau's safe. The dual lock mechanism turned smoothly, and the heavy steel drawer slid open with barely a whisper. Inside, neat stacks of currency were arranged alongside leather portfolios containing bearer bonds and a collection of rare gold coins in protective cases. Smith had brought a large canvas bag, the kind used by the restaurant's linen service, and he began transferring the contents with methodical precision. Each bundle of cash was thick and substantial, bound with rubber bands and bank wrappers that indicated their legitimate origins. The bearer bonds were particularly valuable, negotiable instruments that could be converted to cash without requiring identification or registration. As he worked, Smith remained acutely aware of time. The cleaning crew would finish their duties within the hour, and the building's overnight security guard made rounds every 90 minutes. He had calculated that the entire operation needed to be completed within 45 minutes to ensure a safe passage from the premises without detection. The weight of the stolen items was considerable, nearly 60 pounds of cash, bonds, and precious metals. Smith had anticipated this challenge and had positioned his own vehicle, a nondescript Ford sedan, in a service area behind the restaurant where delivery trucks typically unloaded supplies. The location provided cover from street visibility and direct access to a rear exit that bypassed the main security checkpoint. With the bag loaded and the empty safety deposit box closed, Smith retraced his steps through the vault and back to Moreau's office. He returned the master key to its position in the safe and ensured that no evidence of his presence remained visible. The entire operation had taken 38 minutes from start to finish, well within his planned time frame. Smith exited through the rear service door and loaded the canvas bag into his sedan's trunk. He had removed his uniform, vest, and tie, transforming his appearance from restaurant employee to casual late-night driver. The parking lot was empty except for a few staff vehicles, and the streets of Beverly Hills were quiet in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday morning. Rather than driving directly home, Smith followed a predetermined route through residential neighborhoods, taking a circuitous path designed to avoid major intersections with traffic cameras. His destination was a storage unit in Culver City that he had rented under a false name 3 months earlier, paying cash for a full year in advance. The facility operated with minimal security and no surveillance cameras, making it an ideal temporary hiding place for the stolen items. At the storage unit, Smith transferred the contents of the canvas bag into a series of smaller containers. The cash was divided among multiple duffel bags, the bearer bonds were placed in waterproof document cases, and the coins and jewelry were secured in padded boxes. This distribution served 2 purposes. It made the items easier to transport individually, and it reduced the risk of total loss if any single container was discovered. Smith's plan extended far beyond the theft itself. He had spent months researching identity change procedures, studying cases of individuals who had successfully disappeared and established new lives under different names. He understood that the key to avoiding detection was not just leaving Los Angeles, but creating a completely new persona that could withstand casual scrutiny while avoiding official documentation that might trigger database searches. The following Monday morning, Smith reported to work at the Golden Palm as scheduled, maintaining his normal routine to avoid suspicion. He performed his valet duties with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his employment, giving no indication of the massive theft that lay undiscovered in the basement vault. The stolen money remained safely hidden in the Culver City storage unit while he continued his regular schedule for another full week. This period of normalcy was crucial to Smith's strategy. He knew that when the theft was eventually discovered, investigators would examine the behavior and whereabouts of all employees during the relevant time period. By maintaining his usual patterns for several days after the crime, he created the appearance of innocence that would initially deflect suspicion from his activities. The theft was discovered on March 24th, 9 days after it occurred, when Harold Weinstein's son attempted to access Box 247 on behalf of his recovering father. The discovery triggered an immediate investigation involving both local police and federal authorities, given the substantial value of the stolen items and the interstate implications of the bearer bonds. The restaurant was closed temporarily while forensic teams processed the crime scene, searching for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other traces that might identify the perpetrator. Smith watched the investigation unfold from his position as a concerned employee, expressing appropriate shock and dismay when questioned by detectives. His clean background, steady work history, and apparent cooperation with investigators initially placed him in the category of potential witnesses rather than suspects. The investigation focused primarily on clients who had known about the vault's existence and employees with direct access to security systems. However, Smith understood that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. As the investigation intensified and background checks became more thorough, any inconsistencies in his story or behavior would eventually surface. He had already made preparations for his departure, liquidating his legitimate assets and converting them to cash that could be transported easily. 3 weeks after the theft was discovered, Chris Smith submitted his resignation to the Golden Palm, citing family obligations that required his relocation to another state. His departure was noted but not considered suspicious, as several employees had left following the robbery due to concerns about job security and ongoing police scrutiny. By the time investigators realized that Smith's resignation might be connected to the theft, he had already vanished completely. The man who had been Chris Smith in Beverly Hills ceased to exist on April 15, 1981. His apartment was abandoned with rent paid through the end of the month. His utility accounts were closed, and his California driver's license was never renewed. The storage unit in Culver City was emptied during a single overnight visit, its contents transferred to a recreational vehicle that Smith had purchased with cash from a private seller in Nevada. The recreational vehicle became Smith's mobile transformation chamber as he drove east through Nevada and into Arizona. He had chosen this route deliberately, avoiding the major interstate highways where law enforcement might establish checkpoints or surveillance points. The RV provided both transportation and temporary shelter while he executed the most critical phase of his plan, the complete reconstruction of his identity. Inside the vehicle, Smith had assembled everything necessary for his metamorphosis: hair dye, colored contact lenses, and subtle prosthetics that would alter his facial structure enough to fool casual observation. He had studied identity theft techniques not to steal someone else's life, but to create an entirely fictional one that would pass basic scrutiny. The key was building a background that was mundane enough to avoid attention while being consistent enough to withstand routine verification. His first stop was Flagstaff, Arizona, where he rented a modest apartment using the name David Michael Torres. He had chosen this identity carefully, selecting a common Hispanic surname that would blend seamlessly into the Southwest's diverse population. The first name, David, was close enough to his real name, Chris, that he would respond naturally when addressed, while Michael provided a middle name that could serve as an alternate first name if needed for additional confusion. Creating David Torres required more than just using a false name. Smith had researched the process extensively, learning how individuals without proper documentation could still function in society through a network of cash-based employment, private landlords who didn't conduct thorough background checks, and services that operated outside traditional banking systems. The key was establishing a legitimate presence gradually, building credibility over time rather than attempting to create a complete identity overnight. Smith's first priority was finding employment that would provide both income and legitimacy without requiring extensive background verification. He found work at a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Flagstaff, where his mechanical skills, learned during his youth in a working-class family, proved valuable. The shop owner was grateful to find a reliable worker and asked few questions about Torres's previous employment history. The job served multiple purposes beyond providing cover. It gave Smith access to vehicle registration systems, allowing him to understand how cars were titled and tracked across state lines. This knowledge would prove invaluable for maintaining his new identity while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that might be monitoring traditional documentation systems. Meanwhile, the investigation in Beverly Hills had intensified significantly. Federal agents had taken over the case due to the interstate nature of the bearer bonds and the substantial value of the theft. They had identified Chris Smith as a person of interest after discovering inconsistencies in his employment history and the suspicious timing of his departure from the Golden Palm. However, their search efforts were hampered by Smith's careful preparation and the complete absence of any trail leading from California. The FBI had issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the western United States, but they were searching for Chris Smith, not David Torres. The physical description they circulated was based on Smith's California driver's license photo and testimony from former co-workers, neither of which accounted for the subtle but effective changes he had made to his appearance. Smith understood that his greatest vulnerability lay in financial transactions. The stolen money needed to be converted into legitimate assets gradually, without creating patterns that might attract attention from banking authorities or tax investigators. He developed a careful system for this process, using the cash to make small purchases that could be resold for legitimate currency, essentially laundering the money through a series of private transactions. His method involved purchasing items like tools, electronics, and automotive parts with cash, then selling them through classified advertisements or at swap meets. Each transaction was small enough to avoid suspicion, but collectively allowed him to convert thousands of dollars from the theft into documented income from legitimate sales. He kept meticulous records of these transactions, creating a paper trail that would support his cover story if questioned. The bearer bonds presented a different challenge entirely. These instruments were essentially cash equivalents, but redeeming them required interaction with financial institutions that maintained records and reported large transactions to federal authorities. Smith knew that attempting to cash them immediately would likely trigger an investigation that could expose his location and identity. Instead, he developed a long-term strategy for the bonds. He would wait several years before beginning to redeem them, and then only in small amounts spread across different institutions and time periods. This approach required patience and discipline, but it would allow him to access the full value of the bonds without creating the kind of financial footprint that investigators might detect. As David Torres, Smith established a routine that balanced visibility with anonymity. He attended local community events occasionally, shopped at neighborhood stores, and maintained friendly but not intimate relationships with co-workers and neighbors. This social presence was crucial for establishing legitimacy, but he was careful never to become too prominent or memorable in any particular context. The auto repair shop where he worked provided an ideal environment for this balance. Customers interacted with him briefly and professionally. Mechanics worked independently on their assigned projects, and the shop's owner valued results over personal relationships. Smith could perform his job competently while maintaining the kind of low profile that would not attract unwanted attention. During this period, Smith also began investing portions of his legitimate earnings in small real estate properties. He purchased a modest duplex in a working-class neighborhood, living in one unit while renting the other to generate additional income. This investment served multiple purposes. It provided asset diversification, created additional legitimate income streams, and established deeper roots in the community that would support his cover identity. The rental property also gave Smith experience in property management and real estate transactions, knowledge that would prove valuable as his wealth grew. He learned about property law, tenant rights, and the complex web of regulations that governed rental housing. This expertise would later allow him to expand his real estate holdings more effectively while maintaining his assumed identity. By 1985, 4 years after the theft, David Torres had become a well-established member of the Flagstaff community. He had been promoted to shop foreman at the auto repair facility, owned 2 rental properties, and had even served briefly on a local neighborhood watch committee. His transformation from Chris Smith to David Torres was so complete that even close observation would have revealed no obvious connections to the Beverly Hills valet who had disappeared years earlier. The investigation into the Golden Palm robbery had grown cold during this same period. Federal agents had pursued numerous leads across multiple states, but had found no trace of Chris Smith or the stolen money. The case remained open, but active investigation had been scaled back significantly as resources were redirected to more recent crimes with better prospects for resolution. Smith monitored news coverage of the investigation through newspaper archives and occasional television reports, but references to the case became increasingly rare as time passed. The restaurant itself had closed permanently in 1983, unable to recover from the loss of client confidence following the robbery. Vincent Moreau had relocated to Florida, and most of the other employees had scattered to different jobs throughout Los Angeles. This dispersal of witnesses and evidence worked strongly in Smith's favor. Even if investigators had developed new leads, many of the people who might have provided useful information were no longer easily accessible. The passage of time had eroded memories and eliminated potential sources of evidence that might have exposed his carefully constructed deception. However, Smith understood that his safety depended on more than just the passage of time. He continued to refine and strengthen his David Torres identity, adding layers of documentation and community involvement that would make it increasingly difficult for anyone to question his background. He obtained an Arizona driver's license using legitimate procedures, registered to vote, and even filed tax returns that documented his growing legitimate income. The most challenging aspect of maintaining his false identity was the psychological burden of constant vigilance. Smith could never completely relax or let his guard down, as a single mistake or moment of carelessness could expose decades of careful construction. He developed strict personal rules about social interactions, financial transactions, and public behavior that minimized his risk of detection while allowing him to function normally in most situations. This psychological pressure intensified during the mid-1980s when a series of high-profile fugitive captures made national news. Smith watched these cases carefully, studying how other individuals who had assumed false identities had been discovered and apprehended. Each case provided lessons about potential vulnerabilities in his own situation and prompted him to make additional adjustments to his security protocols. One particularly concerning development was the increasing sophistication of computer databases used by law enforcement agencies. Smith realized that his carefully constructed identity might not withstand the kind of comprehensive background investigation that newer technology made possible. This concern led him to consider relocating again, creating an additional layer of separation between David Torres and any potential connection to Chris Smith. The decision to move came in 1987 when Smith learned that the auto repair shop where he worked was being sold to a larger chain, that would likely implement more stringent employee verification procedures. Rather than risk exposure through enhanced background checks, he decided to relocate to Phoenix, where he could continue his gradual transformation while accessing a larger city's greater anonymity. The move to Phoenix marked the beginning of Smith's most prosperous period as David Torres. He used his accumulated legitimate assets to purchase a small apartment building, expanding his real estate portfolio significantly. The rental income from this property, combined with his savings from years of careful money laundering, provided him with financial independence that eliminated the need for traditional employment. This financial freedom allowed Smith to focus entirely on perfecting his assumed identity. He enrolled in community college courses, joined local business organizations, and even began dating occasionally, though he was careful never to develop relationships that might lead to detailed scrutiny of his background. Each social interaction strengthened his cover, while providing opportunities to practice the kind of normal behavior that would deflect suspicion. By the early 1990s, David Torres had become David Torres in every meaningful sense, except his own private knowledge of the truth. He thought of himself by his assumed name, responded naturally to it in all situations, and had developed genuine relationships and interests that were entirely separate from his previous life as Chris Smith. The psychological transformation was nearly as complete as the legal and social one. This deep integration into his false identity created an unexpected vulnerability. As David Torres became more real and Chris Smith faded into distant memory, Smith began to relax some of the security protocols that had protected him during his early years as a fugitive. He grew more careless about maintaining the strict behavioral discipline that had kept him safe, and he began to take risks that his younger, more paranoid self would never have considered. The most significant of these risks was his growing real estate empire. By the mid-1990s, Torres owned several apartment buildings and had become a recognized figure in Phoenix's property investment community. This success brought increased visibility and documentation that created an extensive paper trail connecting him to his assumed identity. While this trail strengthened his cover in some ways, it also created multiple points of potential exposure if anyone ever began investigating his background seriously. Smith's confidence in his transformation had grown so complete that he had begun to believe his own cover story. The psychological distance between David Torres and Chris Smith had become so vast that he sometimes struggled to remember details of his previous life or the specific steps he had taken during his identity change. This mental separation was both a strength and a weakness, providing psychological protection while potentially making him vulnerable to unexpected challenges to his assumed identity. The bearer bonds that had been such a crucial part of the original theft remained largely untouched throughout this period. Smith had redeemed only small portions of them, always through different financial institutions, and never in amounts large enough to trigger federal reporting requirements. The bulk of the bonds remained secured in safety deposit boxes that he had established under his David Torres identity, waiting for the right moment when he could access their full value without risk. This patience with the bonds reflected Smith's understanding that his greatest asset was time itself. Each year that passed made it less likely that anyone would connect David Torres to Chris Smith. And each year of legitimate activity as Torres made his assumed identity more credible and defensible. He was playing a long game that required discipline and strategic thinking, but the rewards were substantial and growing. The investigation into the Golden Palm robbery had been officially suspended in 1995, 14 years after the crime occurred. Federal agents had exhausted all viable leads and concluded that Chris Smith had likely died or left the country entirely. The case file was transferred to inactive status, though it remained technically open in case new evidence ever surfaced. The story of Chris Smith's transformation into David Torres might have remained buried forever if not for a single moment of carelessness that shattered 26 years of careful construction. In April 2007, Torres parked his luxury sedan in a downtown Phoenix residential zone while visiting a potential real estate acquisition. The parking meter had expired by mere minutes when a traffic officer issued citation number 4471893, a routine violation that should have resulted in nothing more than a modest fine. However, when Torres failed to pay the ticket within the required time frame, the citation entered the city's automated collection system. This system, upgraded with new database technology, cross-referenced unpaid violations with property ownership records as part of an effort to improve collection rates. The search revealed that David Torres owned multiple valuable properties throughout Phoenix, making him a priority target for aggressive collection efforts. The enhanced background investigation that followed exposed inconsistencies in Torres's documented history that had remained hidden for decades. Social Security Administration records showed gaps in his employment history that didn't align with his claimed background. Credit reports revealed the suspicious absence of any financial activity prior to 1981. Most damning of all, fingerprints taken during a routine traffic stop in 1989 had been stored in a database that was finally cross-referenced with unsolved federal cases. When Phoenix police arrested David Torres in his downtown office on May 15, 2007, they found a man who had lived so completely as his assumed identity that he initially seemed genuinely confused by accusations connecting him to Chris Smith. The bearer bonds, discovered in safety deposit boxes registered under the Torres name, still bore federal markings that linked them directly to the Golden Palm theft. The $3.8 million in remaining stolen assets, carefully laundered through decades of real estate transactions, represented one of the largest fugitive recoveries in Arizona's history. Chris Smith, now 54 years old, pleaded guilty to federal theft charges in exchange for a reduced sentence that acknowledged his lack of subsequent criminal activity and his cooperation with investigators. The man, who had successfully vanished for over a quarter century, was ultimately undone not by sophisticated detective work or advanced forensic techniques, but by a $17 parking ticket and the relentless march of technology that finally caught up with his carefully constructed lies. Sometimes the smallest oversights bring down the most elaborate deceptions, proving that even the most perfect crimes contain the seeds of their own undoing.